It may seem as though the Battlefield franchise has always had a 4-class system. After all, 2142, Bad Company 3, BF3, 4, 1 and 5 have all opted for just 4 main classes. But that wasn't always the case. Battlefield 1942 had 5 classes and Battlefield 2, get this, had a whopping 7. And just because a lot of those games had 4 classes does not mean that they had the same ones. Oh no. Over the years, certain roles have been merged. Medic classes have come and gone. Engineer classes have been merged into support, and so on and so forth. And this got me thinking, does Battlefield really know what the best class system really is? And is it time for a new class? Perhaps one that hasn't been in the game before to possibly spice things up. Also, what game did it best? I imagine that lots of people will have different opinions on that one. A new class is an exciting prospect as, let's say, a Tides of War unlock for Battlefield 5, and something that would change up the game drastically and really get people excited again. So let's take a quick walk down memory lane. In BF 1942 you had Assault, Medic, Anti-Tank, Engineer and Scout. And then in BF2 you had Assault, Medic, Anti-Tank, Engineer, Support, Sniper and Special Forces. In 2142 you had Assault, Recon, Engineer and Support. No sign of a Medic there. Bad Company 2, however, did bring Medics back, as well as Assault, Engineer and Recon. No support class there, at least by name. Battlefield 3, on the other hand, is the beginning of the twist, and where we start to see regular classes occurring. Assault, Engineer, Recon and Support. With Assault having the Medic capabilities, they kind of merged it into one. BF4 went down the same route. BF1 on the other hand opted to split Assault and Medic once more and add in Support and Scout. BF5 really stuck with this, with Recon and Scout operating much the same. My point is that even though so many of the most recent games have had 4 classes, none of them have actually offered a new class. It's always essentially Medic, Assault, Support, Sniper, or some kind of merging of those classes. So what if we were to get a brand new class instead, or perhaps a class that we had in an older game but reimagined? And yes, I understand that right now adding new classes isn't a priority for DICE developers with the game in the current state that it's in, but I've been putting a bit of thought into this and I've come up with a Spec Ops class that I want to talk you through. Now, if there are any Battlefield 2 veterans watching this, you'll remember that there was a Special Forces class in Battlefield 2, and we would be taking a few design cues from that, but adding our own twist. Now, I would love to see this going forward for future Battlefield titles, but for now, let's just focus on what a new class could look like within Battlefield 5. So, as I mentioned, this class would be called Spec Ops, and if you followed along you might notice some similarities between the combat roles that were revealed at the very first reveal of BF5. Now, the weapons of choice for the Spec Ops class would be suppressed weapons only. The class would have a variety of guns that I'll get into in a second, but the caveat would be that they are all silenced, and perhaps silenced weapons aren't as useful in BF5 as in other BF titles, but I still think that they would have their place, because this class would be a stealth class in essence, and I feel as though they'd have quieter footsteps too, and perhaps be able to move slightly faster, maybe let's say 5 to 10%. But to counter this class would not have any grenades or explosives at all, and perhaps even a very limited sidearm selection. And you could have combat roles as a way to perhaps customize things. Maybe you could opt for quieter footsteps or faster movement speed, but honestly, I'm not sure that people even delve into class roles at all that much anyway. In fact, I'm convinced that some players don't even know that combat roles exist. Okay, so what I've just outlined there is our core class structure, but what I think would be cool with a stealth class like this is if they had a few unique melee weapons with unique attributes. What about this? What if they had a fiber wire melee weapon that offered up a really quick takedown animation? Remember in the reveal trailer we kind of saw something like this, so what if they had access to something like that in the game? Imagine if you could move up behind someone and it just played this incredibly quick, cool animation where you use the fiber wire, flip the enemy around and just carried on moving in a really smooth, quick transition. I'd definitely say that the Spec Ops class would have a faster melee takedown time to accommodate for their incredible skill, of course. Now, before we get into the weapons, we should probably touch on gadgets. I mentioned before that Spec Ops would have no available grenades because I think if you're making a faster class like that and you want to change up the meta of the game, that just makes sense. I do think though that throwing knives or a throwing axe could be a really good addition to this class. Even though the Recon does have it already, maybe the Spec Ops class throwing knife could do slightly more damage. The other options I thought could work would be a smoke grenade launcher, a climbing rope, and wait for it, a crossbow. Now the climbing rope would hark back to the Spec Ops class in BF2 that had a zipline. Of course a zipline really isn't that feasible in World War II, but a climbing rope could be useful in certain situations and maps where you want to get up a sheer vertical wall or rock formation, or perhaps even just into a higher building and scramble through a window. The smoke grenade launcher, well, I think that speaks for itself, but it could be very useful for getting behind enemy lines. And the crossbow, on the other hand, is probably the most interesting, and in fact, this crossbow was actually something that was used in Britain's Special Operations Executive for covert missions in World War II, when even a suppressed pistol was sometimes perhaps too loud. It even had a name. It was called Little Joe. Check that thing out, it's badass. Or what about this? A gadget where if you creep up behind an enemy tank, like a Tiger tank or something, and it's stationary, you can apply some kind of bomb to the back of the tank, but it takes 5 seconds to do it. However, if you get it on there and it explodes, it permanently disables that tank until a support player can fully repair it. Could be a big risk-reward kind of thing, and an interesting way to disable vehicles. Now when it comes to weapons, there's quite a lot to choose from. We want the Spec Ops class to be a close range in your face kind of class, not too dissimilar to Medic, and so, as such, for most of their weaponry, I'm going to give them suppressed SMGs, and maybe with some other weapons mixed in there too. For example, the M3 grease gun just looks so cool when suppressed. Look at the size of that barrel. I think the same for the Sten too. Now we also know from some data mining that the well rod is coming to the game at some point, so that's also another contender. Of course we could add in the commando carbine there too. It's already in the game, but perhaps on this class no scopes were available for it. And I know that some of you may be thinking right now that this all sounds a bit perhaps far-fetched and a pipe dream. Well, there is actually some history here. Back when BF5 was revealed and DICE were showing off their class archetypes, or combat roles as we now know them, as I mentioned, there was a paratrooper role for the Recon that had a lot of what I've just talked about. It was a stealthy close range role with silenced SMGs, silent footsteps and throwing knives. And for whatever reason, those different archetypes are not in the game today. I would hazard a guess and say that DICE inevitably didn't want to lock certain weapons and gadgets within a class behind an archetype, and maybe they felt that if you're playing a class you should be able to have access to everything that that class offers without having to pick an archetype. So what we'd be doing here is taking elements of that idea, and instead of utilizing it as a combat role for Recon, we'd be making this into its own class entirely. And the main reason I think a new class would be interesting is because this would definitely change up the meta of the game. And when has something like this happened in Battlefield? It's been a very long time. Maybe that's something that players can get on board with. And I've mentioned recently about Tides of War and how I think that there isn't really all that many interesting items to unlock each week. So what if one week there was a whole new class added to the game in Tides of War? I think that would be awesome and would absolutely get some interest back. I'm not saying it specifically has to be the Spec Ops class that we've just made up and talked about here. It could be anything. And this is just an example of what could be done. And I do accept that new classes are relatively hard to create, because how do you just create a new role within the game, especially when your source material is World War II and it's already pretty limited. You don't want class roles overlapping each other too much, do you? And I would liken adding new classes to Battlefield similar to how they add new operators to Rainbow Six Siege, because when a new operator gets added into that game, it's usually 2 at once. The meta changes for a bit and you can really see a shift in what players are doing, what operators they want to choose in certain combat situations, and how do they go up against the new ones. And while Battlefield is not a game like Rainbow Six Siege, whereby there are specific operators that have designated roles that are meant to combat each other, I think there's still enough room for Battlefield to be a bit more dynamic in the new content that it puts out. And a new class maybe would be good for the game. Wrapping things up, we all know that DICE has some work ahead of them to improve the game in some big areas, and I'm not suggesting that they take their eyes off the ball with that and just stop work on bug fixing, because that's the most important thing. But this is more of a future concept and idea. Even if it wasn't for BF5, maybe future Battlefield games. Why have we not had a new class in as long as I can remember? Is it because we simply don't need one? It could be, and having too many classes just overcomplicates things. That could absolutely be the case, but I don't see we can't at least approach or dip our feet in with that idea. Tides of War brings with it new cosmetic items, new weapons, new maps, and we all love maps. But why not perhaps a new class too? Although if it did happen and the class proved to be popular, I don't think it should follow the limited time mode system, because that would just lead to big frustration. Imagine if you haven't been able to unlock a class because you missed a week of Tides of War. That would suck. Perhaps it could just be introduced for free and everyone gets it. That would be the best case scenario. With that said, I'm going to leave it there for today, guys. Do let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you could put a new class into BF5, what would their primary weapons be? What would their roles be? And what kind of gadgets would they have? Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.